Hello, listeners. This is Tosca at NGO Soul+Strategy. I'm not an innovation specialist. I'm also not a specialist in adaptive management, but I have a strong interest in change management. I've been interested for years in the question why NGOs tend to be quite self-critical when it comes to their ability to innovate or to adapt in an agile manner, why they feel the need to get better at this, and what organizational leadership can do about this, what this has to do with organizational culture, etc. Well, I met Emma Proud, my guest today, only once, years ago, while she worked at MercyCorps. But her advice to me about leadership for adaptive management made me immediately curious about her knowledge base, her broader knowledge base. So here we are today interviewing her. Emma, welcome.
Thank you, Tosca. Hello, everybody. Lovely to be here.
Thank you for being with us. So Emma Proud is currently the head of learning and adapting at Brink. And I'll ask in a moment what Brink is all about. My understanding is that it builds adaptive working practices which help organizations create the context for innovation. And Brink applies behavioral innovation to help organizations adapt and innovate better. And I remember that what you taught me years ago about behavioral nudges, etc. That was quite new to me at that time. Emma was formerly at MercyCorps, the director of organizational agility, also the director before that of the Center for Adaptive Management at MercyCorps. She played other roles at MercyCorps as well as at Save the Children, and she started her career in private sector consulting. So Emma, let's jump in. What is Brink and what is your role there?
Thank you, Tosca. So Brink is UK and now Rwanda-based behavioral innovation practice, as you mentioned. And for us, behavioral innovation is an innovation that really puts people and systems at the core as well. So behavioral innovation says not just methods, but you should also think about mindsets and mechanisms that incentivize behavior. So I'm the head of learning and adapting. And as part of that role, we work with teams and organizations and consortia to try and create the context for innovation and adaptation. So we know the power of having teams on the ground being adaptive and innovative, right? If we want to change the world and make a big dent. But what we've realized is it's not even just donor constraints and things like this, but actually the organizational context really, creates the context for how you can adapt and innovate. So what are the norms and the nudges that you can create, and how can you remove blockers that may be stopping people behaving in a way that's really aligned with your vision?
Super interesting. I want to know though a little bit, Emma, so practically, as the head of learning and adapting in Brink, what do you take client organizations through step by step in strengthening their ability to innovate and to adapt?
Great question. So the answer that I can give, we've used recently several times for different contexts. So it might be for a consortium that brings together innovation and research partners that need to work together. Or we've got at the moment a UK government department, all the way through to philanthropists and foundations. And the process is very similar actually to the one that we describe in our work with OECD, in the Stanford Social Innovation Review on the adoption of innovation. And it's a kind of process that's almost like a double diamond, Tosca, that puts the first part starts with a vision. And you know, there's a lot of research and fantastic work at the moment about the power of imagination. And we know that people are tired and wrung out, right? That lots of people are overworked and don't want another kind of change process. So we found it incredibly powerful to tap into a future state. You know, it really sparks buy-in and commitment and gathers alignment. So why would we want to go through this whole process? What might the future look like? we think a lot in terms of systems. So what could the emergent system be like, right? Without any constraints. So we start looking forward, and then we try and kind of map the current landscape and say, okay, that's where we want to get to. Where are we now? You know, and we use a diagnostic that covers the behavioral innovation pieces. So not just the methods that are being used in an organization, but also what do the mindsets look like now? What are the mechanisms? And when I say mechanisms, I mean things like, what are you nudged towards from your processes, your budgeting, your planning? You know,
so this is all the organizational processes and systems that on a day-to-day basis nudge people to behave in certain ways, and also are signal the organizational culture in terms of what these are the behaviors that the organization wants, or these are the things it wants to discourage. Is that what we're talking about?
Exactly. And the thing that we particularly try to highlight is, where do those things not fit with your ambitions? So you say you want us to be innovative and ambitious and adaptive, and yet actually our systems pull us back to linear planning, delivering what we said we were going to do, keeping us on short cycles, you know. So that's often a very interesting conversation. So whether it's through, we've done interviews. I love also just doing kind of emergent workshops. You get almost the same amount of information as from interviews to decide to define these things. But what's beautiful is if you do a session, you're bringing people with you on the journey rather than it being your own knowledge. So then we might start digging into, well, okay, these are the factors that will affect it. These ones seem to be the most important here. And when I say most important, I'm also not just talking about, we don't go in saying, what are the barriers? You know, what are the things that are wrong? Like, we take a very appreciative approach and really try and build on what's working. And I think that also helps people tap into possibility, which is a beautiful thing. The last stage, I would say, is, so you've done the vision, the mapping the landscape. There's the next stage, which is about trying to shift the system, right? So, but we don't know what the answer is. You're not going to go in, you know, handbrakes off we go, let's head. It's much more iterative. So we're taking principles of innovation and applying it to this process. How can we test? What can we experiment with? And sometimes we try and take a top-down as well as a bottom-up approach, so we can see whether what we're trying is actually making any difference to people on the ground.
Okay.
The last thing I would say is the importance of kind of storytelling. So how can you be telling a story, first of all, about the vision that you created so you can bring people with you? How can you keep closing the loop on what you're learning as you go through, so it feels less, you know, we don't want, it's not something done to an organizational team, very much with, right? And how can you be painting a picture of what is working and what's changing, so people actually feel they want to come with you and continue?
Oh, interesting. And in our introductory chat before we started recording, you said, Tosca, I'm not an innovation coach. So tell me what prompted you. So what is it about your role that you would emphatically say, I'm not an innovation coach? I'm curious.
Well, I work at an organization that is full of innovation coaches. So Brink does lots of work coaching ventures and pilots and funds, right, as innovation coaches.
Okay.
So I guess I think the way that I think of it working is they're doing the brilliant work, making a difference for those. And what we're trying to do is create the context within larger organizations for that innovation to be possible.
That broader organizational context again. Thank you. That's helpful just for me to understand. All right. So as I said, I'm not an innovation expert or coach, but I've had a number of people in the podcast being interviewed for the podcast that are innovation coaches, or more broadly, kind of their role is to encourage innovation in their organizations, right? Sometimes as top organizational leaders as well. So they have mentioned a number of factors that often are obstacles that I want to ask you about, and just kind of run them by you and say, what do you think? Is that something that you have encountered or not? Is this significant or not? So let's try several. So leadership mindsets, right? I'm very interested in leadership, so let me start there, but there will be other variables. Leadership mindset. So I've been told that organizational leaders may be overconfident in their ability to project, or the organization's ability to project, right? That we all have cognitive biases, which of course all of us have. If you have a brain, you have a bias. And that leaders particularly have a hard time in trying to promote innovation in their organization, in staying focused on both the desirability and the viability of potential innovations. Instead, they kind of get bogged down in feasibility and compliance concerns. Love your comment on that.
So leadership mindsets, and I mean, I would go beyond it and say mindsets per se have a massive impact, I think, on how innovative an organization can be. We find, you're right, I think, overconfident. There are some interesting things that come up for me here, actually. There's risk appetite that is a big thing too.
Yeah.
And being concerned about the risk of the right or different things, not the right things. Some innovation can be seen as, that halo effect of the new.
The shiny.
So the shiny, the new, like these things are brilliant, and actually we will invest in bringing this in, but people are not perhaps quite so good at stopping things.
I was going to ask you. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah.
Right, like you've got this idea of sort of killing your darlings. Like by the time it gets through, you care so much about it. It's because it comes from that place of caring. And investment, and sunk cost bias and things that we know. But actually, when considering risk, those are things that are not often considered too much. We don't talk enough, I think, about stopping. We don't talk enough about the risk of doing nothing. You might think, to your point, about the compliance risks or the risks of doing something new, but we don't say, well, what's the risk of not doing it? What's the risk of business as usual? And I mean, that can be humongous. So
those are things that come to mind. Lovely. I loved how you added some dimensions. How about there's well-known authors on innovation who write that in the social sector we tend to fall in love with the solution, what we think the solution should be, too early, and we don't can stay in love with the problem long enough. Is that an issue that you've seen in your clients?
Yeah, I think it goes to the point of not stopping things either, because it's the solution that has been fallen in love with. Something that we're trying to do increasingly, actually, is move clients towards an innovation portfolio, like an intentional portfolio. And one of the places that I think that's really interesting is to try and help make the connection between the strategy and the work, right? And to actually be able to make those decisions so that you don't fall in love with the solution rather than the problem. And actually, so that's a really nice mechanism and a nice way to have actually had a conversation early on, right? Like if you're doing portfolio management, then you want to have a conversation about criteria, for example, before you start talking about the actual interventions or innovations, because then it can make it, you can still bring soft things in. You can still say one of our criteria is gut feel. One of our criteria is organizational alignment, right? It doesn't all have to be hard numbers, but that helps you, I think, have a dialogue about what's the problem that we're trying to address with these solutions, and is it working? Are we seeing signals of, success that we should be investing more in this solution and dialing this one back?
Yeah, dialing up and down. I want to ask you something about what you said about portfolios of innovation and alignment with strategy. So I have had the sense before that sometimes NGOs and nonprofits in general kind of say, okay, we're just going to unleash whatever number of iterative innovations, but many of them are not at all connected to any set of strategic priorities, which then brings up the question, innovation is about unleashing, the cliche would say, but there have to be some boundaries around that, right? In order to make sure that it's actually useful to some strategic priorities. Do you see that tension? Like, it's not just about letting everything go. There's still some boundary setting. Can you talk to me about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm totally with you, Tosca. And I think the concept of an intentional portfolio is really a nice antidote to that, actually. And we've done some work recently with a large international NGO on this very thing. The fact that there was like a disconnect almost between all the incredibly valuable hard work and the strategy, and just literally visualizing it and saying, well, how do these bits connect? Right? And recognizing that, yes, it's important to unleash innovation, but we're working in systems and complexity too, right? So nothing's ever going to be a silver bullet. So if you've got a portfolio, it also gives you the opportunity to see and test the interaction of different pieces.
Okay, I got it.
And I would add, you know, you have to have some really difficult conversations from early on about what are we going to do with these things which are not in our portfolio? Are we just going to say no? Are we saying that actually we've identified a really important leverage point, and yes, we do want to be really intentional about putting our research, innovation, like channeling our efforts into here? Yeah. But that brings difficult choices, so it's important to have those conversations like early on, I think.
And choice making is not necessarily a strength that I see a lot in our sector. Let me try another variable. Some innovation coaches have told me that they find that nonprofits are overly process-oriented and not sufficiently outcome-oriented. How do you respond to that? So they're very like, oh, we need to follow these processes and organizational processes, I mean, but they're not sufficient focused. Will this innovation actually make us more outcome oriented and contribute to outcomes? Is that...
I'm sorry to keep tying it back to the same. I feel like I'm what's the word? One trick pony. I think again, this is something that speaks to the value of an innovation portfolio, right? Because you're not, if you're just doing your innovation on its own, then you can be looking at the processes, you can be trying to make sure that that innovation is doing brilliantly. But if you haven't got a sense of why, I say an innovation portfolio, in NGO speak, it could be, think of it like a theory of change, right? But a theory of change that you really use, and a theory of change that you're actually making decisions on. But I think the clearer the narrative is between your innovation and the outcome, then the more information that you have to be making those decisions on.
I like that narrative, yeah, of the innovation to the outcome. Making a few notes here. Yeah. You've already talked about the difficulty with stopping, right? When it's stopping organizational processes that are interrupting or obstructing innovation from happening. A leader who I interviewed recently said to me, we have a hard time removing old processes when we are introducing innovations. So is that attachment to what is known? Is that risk averseness? Is that, we know that human beings are more focused on preventing loss than on making gains, if you will. We're very concerned about losing, more concerned than gaining. How does that resonate with you?
So one thing that pops up for me is that comes from our piece of work on the adoption of innovation. And we talk, I've lost my thought, Tosca, hold on.
That's all right.
No, so we're talking about the processes. Okay, sorry.
Old processes.
So
yeah,
that when you're scaling an innovation, you kind of need when you're growing an innovation, you need a particular skill set, right? Like you need to care very much about the innovation and everything else.
Yeah.
When it comes to making sure it's adopted, and let me give you just a quick summary of the principle of the paper is, if we want to create change in the world, like innovation in little pockets, doesn't help, right? Like one way that you can really create change is to try and get these innovations adopted into the whole organization. So take it, I mean, we're doing this work with bilaterals, with NGOs. If you think about something like behavioral insights or adaptive management, right? Drones, blockchain, like having small bright spots is one thing. But if each time it needs to be an innovation and needs to prove things and everything, it slows down. There's an opportunity for a leverage point of the whole organization understanding. Take adaptive management at USAID or cash transfers at World Food Programme, right? Like people don't have to think of them as an innovation anymore. When they see a problem, they open their organizational toolkit, and that's an obvious tool that they might use, right? In trying to mainstream or adopt those innovations, as we've talked about before, there will be some processes that need to shift, right? Like the whole process of mainstreaming actually needs a different skill set from the innovation. It needs much more of an organizational change skill set, because you need to be thinking about the mechanisms, the processes, the mindsets. So what I would say is, it's maybe not also that we're not willing to go there, but that we often don't change hats. So we often don't take off the innovation hat and think through, what do we need to think about in terms of organizational change, which would mean stopping processes, changing processes.
That's really interesting. And so these are almost like two constituents and two skill sets, as you said, those who are really focused on innovation and those who are focused on shepherding and a mainstreaming through change management or organizational change processes, right? Yeah. How do those, I don't want to stereotype this, but do those two sets of actors, if you will, talk different languages? Do they have a hard time talking to each other, or have you seen that being quite smooth?
Well, interestingly, what we've found is there are very few conversations about the adoption of innovation, which is a conversation that we're really trying to have, right? Because you don't need to keep innovating all the time. If we know this works, we want it to happen more. But there's a bit of a disconnect, and the incentives to go to a topic that I know is dear to both of our hearts, Tosca, the incentives are not there. So on the ground, let's take somewhere like the UN, the United Nations, right? On the ground, there are people who are very rooted in context, who come up with a great innovation for that place. They care deeply, they do the innovation, they can see the impact it's making. They don't necessarily have a view to the top of the organization and across the organization.
Correct.
To think, how could this be useful for this place? How can we get this moved up?
Yeah.
Right. So it's not even necessarily that the communication is not happening, but what job institutionally are we doing to name and connect the pioneers, to think about the changes that need to happen to sort of build that emergent system that's got it embedded.
Yeah, it's complex stuff what you're talking about. I admire people who have to actualize that in organizations. Our colleagues who are doing that. Another thing that I've wondered about, and again, as a lay person when it comes to innovation, is innovation, some people say it primarily has to be about big breakthroughs. Others are saying, no, lots of small tweaks are just as significant. I hear mixed messages about this. How do you see that?
When I was at MercyCorps, Anne-Maid Chang, who's written the book Lean Impact, was the Chief Innovation Officer. And I always remember her quote for me of innovation is about better, not new, you know, and I think innovation doesn't always have to be the new big shiny thing. You know, Google wasn't the first search engine, for example. It's interesting when you think, I guess, about some of the shifts that we need to create that maybe need much more transformative innovation. So I think there are many levels at which innovation is useful. I think are we getting to a point where, you know, we need to create a narrative and ways of properly transformative systemic systems innovation too, is something that I'm particularly interested in at the moment.
Okay. All right, looking at the time, I want to ask you, there are a couple more questions. There are some people who say, listen, the main thing we need to do in NGOs when we want to promote an innovation-friendly culture and way of working is that we need to protect particular innovation projects in the portfolio. Hopefully there's a portfolio. They need to be protected from the usual compliance expectations, rules, and bureaucratic constraints. So they need to kind of have their own space where we're shielding them from what are the regular bureaucratic pressures. Does that work? Is that true? What have you seen?
I mean, it works for those. I'm sure it works for those innovations, right? I think what it doesn't do is say, well, hold on a minute, why do we need to create this bubble? What's wrong with, surely all of our programs should be able to be innovative and adaptive,
changeable,
right? So if you do that, then you're also not asking yourself the hard questions of what's holding other programs or initiatives back, and how can we tweak that so that we're actually nudging towards adaptive behaviors and ways of working in the rest of our portfolio.
You've used the word nudging a lot. Now that's known as a concept by some of us, but not by all. So why don't we just go back, take one step back for a moment and tell our audience what nudging is all about.
So nudging is making one option, you're nudging someone towards that to make it easier rather than on another path. So a simple nudge might be at a supermarket. If there's a nudge to get you to buy sweets, is to put the sweets at the cash desk, right?
Yes.
In this context, we could think about simple things like, if I think back to the history of adaptive management, for a long time, we thought of it as a marketing campaign, actually. And what can we do to be getting people to aware of what adaptive management is, thinking about it more, applying it in their work. And, you know, you might rate things by the number of times a website's been looked at or an article's been read. And then we realize that they may read it, but that's not actually shaping their behavior. So what can you do to nudge, to create ease for different ways of doing things? So for example, what can you put into a reporting template where you're actually nudging, what have you learned? How are you changing in response to what you've learned, right? Or you might change, again, we've been working with an NGO on their process of how they're putting learning and reflecting into their reporting process, into their planning process, and into the budgeting, right? So it's to do with the process that goes with it as well. So how can you make it the easy choice? Maybe that's the way to put choice for people.
I like that. I like that a lot. All right.
And so that you don't have to think of it. You're reducing the cognitive load, because you're not saying, okay, now I've read about adaptive management, how do I translate it? What becomes more important in that context is people are doing it. Even if they don't know, they're being more adaptive. You're creating a pull, an attractor towards that new way of doing things.
Pull, an attractor. Yeah, I like that. So last question before we get to the end. Tell us a little bit about some positive outliers. So organizations, particularly in the development sphere, whether they're donors or NGOs or others, the nonprofit sphere, the social sector, positive outliers, organizations that just really quickly got, or always were maybe, into easy adaptive management and adoption, not just generation, but also adoption of innovation. What do you see them do? And what attributes makes them positive outliers on what some people otherwise would say can be a sector that's quite limited when it comes to its innovation capabilities?
So I think there are two parts to what you've asked. One of like, what are they, and one about the attributes. So one organization or philanthropist that I really enjoyed working with recently was the Lego Foundation. And I loved that they'd basically embedded a principle, the 10x principle, from innovation into their real being. So they had increased the number of children they wanted to reach exponentially, because they knew that if they changed the numbers big enough, it demanded a change of how they did the work, right? Like you just could not reach that by following business as usual. Right. So they created an internal nudge, an internal incentive to change ways of working. Then they started working in cross-functional teams. They started working on particular challenges. And we were working with them on how to make sure that those teams were kind of involved in this process of learning and adapting and visioning, actually, and thinking through their portfolio. And then they were also up for working on the processes and systems and lifting the hood and working on things like how grant management was done. What's the implication of this for roles with partners? So that's a great example, and I think probably epitomizes some of the traits, like a willingness to open to open the lid, to pop the hood and look kind of actually in the engine of what's going on, and then being up for actually changing. The other thing that I notice is with positive outliers is I'm increasingly, Tosca, trying to apply my systems thinking to the systems inside an organization. So recognizing that you're not going to have one single point solution for these changes, but actually trying to probe and experiment in different ways. And working on mindsets. You mentioned leadership mindsets before, and we often think of senior leadership, but I think there's a recognition in the positive outliers that also needs to cascade down.
Yeah, and middle managers.
Yeah, right. I think it's such an important leverage point. And the relationship of those middle managers with their teams.
Yes. Lot of leverage there. Yeah. Nice. Very nice. Well, Emma, we need to bring this to a close. So if people want to learn more about you, about Brink, and where should they go? I am definitely going to also link to the Stanford Social Innovation Review article, which I read several months ago, and which reminded me that it was high time that I would talk to you again, and I'm so glad I did. So where else can people find out about you? I'm on Twitter, which is Emma Proud, and I've been trying an experiment of writing a little bit more, which has been fun. Let me know what you think. On LinkedIn, and to find more about Brink, we have a beautiful website, hellobrink.co. Hellobrink.com. And Co. Okay, thank you. I will fix that. Good. Then people will be able to find about you. This was a fascinating conversation. I love the topic, and I think you have a brilliant type of job. So thank you very much, Emma, for all your insights. And thank you, listeners. If you found this podcast episode stimulating, then be sure to check out the other podcast episodes on innovation and adaptive management. We have interviews there with innovation coaches, with managers and leaders in public organizations, including NGOs. And you can find many of those, not just on my website, but also on our YouTube channel. Sign up for our email list and you'll be the first to know when we drop interesting episodes like this one today with Emma Proud. Well, this is Tosca, and I look forward to seeing you again, spending time with you on NGO Soul and Strategy next time.